The hunger pangs gnawed at Daisy Miller's empty stomach as she stared longingly at the fresh loaves displayed in Hayes City's only bakery. 3 days without a proper meal had left her dizzy and desperate, her once fine dress now dusty and worn from weeks on the road. Kansas in 1877 was no place for a woman alone, but circumstances had forced her hand, and now she found herself contemplating the unthinkable theft. The bell above the door jingled as a well-to-do couple exited the shop, and Daisy slipped inside, the warm, yeasty aroma nearly bringing tears to her eyes. Mr. Finch, the round-faced baker, was busy with another customer at the far end of the counter. With trembling fingers, Daisy reached for a small loaf, tucking it quickly into the folds of her shawl. "Just what do you think you're doing, miss?" The baker's voice boomed across the shop, and Daisy froze. Mr. Finch advanced toward her, red-faced and indignant, while curious onlookers gathered at the windows. I'm sorry," Daisy stammered, fumbling to return the bread, her face burning with shame. "I haven't eaten in days." "That's no excuse for thievery." Mr. Finch seized her wrist. "Sheriff Lawson will hear about this. We don't tolerate thieves in Hayes City." "That won't be necessary," came a deep voice from the doorway. Daisy turned to see a tall man silhouetted against the bright Kansas sunlight. He stepped into the bakery, and she could make out his features ruggedly handsome with sun-weathered skin, dark hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of a summer storm. His clothes were those of a working cowboy, worn leather boots, denims, and a cotton shirt with a bandana at his throat. "I believe the lady was helping me," he said smoothly. "I asked her to select some bread while I hitched my horse." Mr. Finch narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Is that so?" "It is." The stranger stepped forward, removing his hat. "And I'd like to pay for more than just that loaf. In fact—" His gaze swept over the bakery's offerings, then returned to Daisy's face, noting her hollow cheeks and the dark circles beneath her eyes. "I'd like to purchase a feast." "2 of each pastry you have, Mr. Finch, along with your largest loaves." The baker's demeanor changed instantly at the prospect of such a sale. "Of course, Mr. Nash. Right away." As Mr. Finch bustled about collecting the items, the cowboy turned to Daisy and spoke quietly. "Zeke Nash, madam, and you look like you could use a proper meal." "Daisy Miller," she whispered, too stunned and mortified to say more. "Well, Miss Miller, would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner this evening?" He spoke formally, but his eyes held kindness. "I reckon we could both use the company." Daisy hesitated. She'd learned to be wary of men's intentions, especially in frontier towns. Yet there was something about Zeke Nash that didn't set off the warning bells that had kept her alive this far west. Perhaps it was the respectful distance he maintained, or the lack of leering in his gaze, or maybe it was just the desperate hunger that clouded her judgment. I couldn't impose," she finally said, though her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. Zeke's lips quirked in a smile. "It's no imposition. I've been eating my own cooking for far too long." He lowered his voice. "Besides, it looks like you could use a friend in Hayes City." Mr. Finch returned with an enormous basket filled with bread, pastries, and pies. "That'll be $3.20, Mr. Nash." Daisy's eyes widened at the sum more than she'd seen in weeks. Zeke paid without comment, adding a generous tip that made the baker's previous anger evaporate completely. "The Dodge House serves a fine steak," Zeke said, lifting the heavy basket. 7 o'clock. Daisy knew she should refuse. She had nothing suitable to wear, nowhere decent to freshen up, and every reason to be suspicious of this stranger's kindness. But hunger and loneliness were powerful motivators. 7 o'clock, she agreed softly. Zeke nodded, satisfaction warming his gaze. "Until then, Miss Miller." He placed a small loaf in her hands before departing, tipping his hat with a gentle smile that reached his eyes. Daisy stood in the bakery doorway, clutching the bread, watching the tall cowboy stride down the dusty main street of Hays City. She had no idea what she'd just agreed to, or whether she'd made a terrible mistake. But for the first time in months, she felt something other than fear and desperation, a flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame in a prairie wind. The room Daisy had managed to secure at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was tiny and sparsely furnished, but it was clean. She'd spent her last coins on it yesterday, gambling that Hays City might offer work opportunities the smaller towns hadn't. Now, sitting on the narrow bed, she devoured the bread Zeke had given her in small, measured bites, savoring each mouthful and forcing herself not to eat too quickly after days of near starvation. As her hunger subsided, doubt crept in. What was she thinking, agreeing to dine with a stranger? Daisy had fled Philadelphia with good reason, and trusting too easily could lead to disaster. Yet something about Zeke Nash seemed genuine in a way she'd learned to recognize during her difficult journey west. She had 3 hours to decide whether to keep their dinner engagement. 3 hours to make herself presentable with nearly nothing to work with. The once fine blue dress she wore was her last possession of value, though travel had left it wrinkled and dusty. Daisy filled the porcelain basin with water from the pitcher and set about washing away the grime of the road as best she could. Meanwhile, across town at the livery stable, Zeke Nash brushed down his stallion, Thunder, his mind on the woman he'd encountered in the bakery. There was a story there he could tell by the way she held herself, proud despite her circumstances, and the educated accent she couldn't quite hide. Not the usual sort to be caught stealing bread in a frontier town. Got yourself in another situation, haven't you, Nash? He muttered to himself, earning a curious look from his horse. Zeke had a reputation for getting involved in other people's troubles, a trait his father had always said would be his undoing. But he couldn't have walked past that bakery and ignored what was happening. Not with the fear in her eyes or the fierce determination beneath it. After ensuring Thunder was properly settled, Zeke headed to his room above the saloon where he kept lodgings when in Hays City. It wasn't fancy, but it served his needs when he wasn't out with the herd. He'd been lucky to secure employment with the Bar X Ranch after arriving from Texas 5 years earlier. Working his way up from ordinary cowhand to trail boss had earned him respect and decent wages, though most of his earnings went to support his mother and sisters back in San Antonio. Zeke scrubbed himself thoroughly in the metal tub he'd had filled with hot water, shaved carefully, and donned his best shirt saved for town visits and special occasions. He wasn't sure why he was taking such pains for dinner with a woman who'd likely view him as nothing more than a momentary savior in a difficult situation. But something about Daisy Miller intrigued him in a way no woman had in quite some time. By 6:45, Zeke was waiting in the lobby of the Dodge House, the finest establishment in Hays City. It wasn't grand by Eastern standards, but it served quality food and maintained a respectable atmosphere important if he wanted Miss Miller to feel comfortable. At 5 minutes past 7, Zeke began to wonder if she'd decided not to come. He wouldn't blame her. Caution was a survival skill for women traveling alone. But then the door opened and Daisy stepped inside. She'd worked wonders with limited resources. Her blue dress had been carefully pressed, her honey blonde hair arranged in a simple but elegant style. She'd clearly washed away the dust of travel, revealing a naturally fair complexion. Though still thin from evident hardship, there was no denying her beauty, enhanced by intelligent green eyes that surveyed the room warily before finding him. Zeke rose immediately, crossing to meet her. "Miss Miller," he greeted her, fighting the unexpected flutter in his chest. "I'm mighty glad you came, Mr. Nash," she offered a reserved smile. "I wanted to thank you properly for your intervention today." "It was nothing," he assured her, guiding her toward the table he'd reserved in a quieter corner. "Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," she replied softly. The waitress approached, and Zeke ordered for them both after a brief consultation 2 of the house specialty steaks, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and apple pie to follow. When the waitress departed, an awkward silence fell. "How long have you been in Hayes City, Miss Miller?" Zeke finally asked. "2 days," she answered, fidgeting with her napkin. "And you may call me Daisy if you wish. It seems overly formal to stand on ceremony after today's incident." "Daisy," he nodded, liking the way it sounded. "Then I'm Zeke to you. What brings you to our little corner of Kansas?" She hesitated, and he could see her constructing a careful answer. "Opportunity," she finally said. "I'm seeking employment." "What sort of work do you do?" "I was a teacher in Philadelphia," she admitted. "But I'm prepared to consider other respectable options." Zeke nodded thoughtfully. "Teachers are always needed out here. Have you inquired at the school?" "I went yesterday, but they have no current openings." She sighed. "I had hoped to find something quickly. My funds have proven inadequate for the journey." The understated way she referenced her obvious destitution touched him. "What made you leave Philadelphia for the frontier? It's not an easy life, especially for a woman alone." Again, that careful hesitation. "Sometimes one must choose between difficult options," she finally said. The frontier seemed to offer a fresh start. Before Zeke could inquire further, their food arrived, generous portions that made Daisy's eyes widen. He noticed how she restrained herself from diving into the meal despite her evident hunger, taking delicate bites with impeccable manners that confirmed his suspicions about her background. "This is wonderful," she said after a few mouthfuls. "I can't thank you enough." "No need for thanks," he assured her, "though I admit I'm curious about your story." She looked up at him, wariness returning to her gaze. "There's not much to tell." "I suspect that's not true," he countered gently, "but I won't pry. Everyone out here has something they've left behind. It's the nature of the frontier." Her shoulders relaxed slightly at his understanding. "And what about you, Mr. Nash?" "Zeke, what brought you to Hayes City?" "Work, mainly. I'm a trail boss for the Bar X ranch outside of town. We drive cattle up from Texas to the railhead here." He took a sip of coffee. "Originally came from San Antonio after the war, needed a change of scenery." "The war? You seem too young to have fought," she observed. "I was young but old enough," he said, not elaborating on those difficult years. "Been working cattle since I was 14. It's a good living if you don't mind the hard work and long periods away from civilization." They continued eating, their conversation gradually becoming easier as they discussed safer topics, the changing nature of the frontier towns as the railroads expanded, the brutal Kansas winters compared to their respective home states, and the latest news from the East that reached them through weeks-old newspapers. When the apple pie arrived, Daisy's reserve had melted enough that Zeke caught glimpses of the woman beneath the careful facade, intelligent, well-read, with flashes of unexpected humor. He found himself increasingly drawn to her, even as he recognized the barriers between them. "May I ask," he ventured when they'd finished eating, "what your plans are now? Do you have accommodations?" "I have a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house," she said, then added hesitantly, "though only for tonight. I had hoped to find employment before my funds ran out completely." Zeke considered this information carefully. There might be positions available that haven't been advertised. The ranch owner's wife was mentioning the need for a governess for their children. And I know Doc Wilson has been looking for someone who can read and write well to help with his records and correspondence. Hope flickered in Daisy's eyes. I would be grateful for any introduction you might provide. I'll speak to them tomorrow, Zeke promised. In the meantime, he hesitated, not wanting to offend her pride. The bakery items I purchased this morning are far too many for one person. Would you consider taking some with you? It seems a shame to let good food go to waste. Daisy's cheeks flushed, but practicality won out over pride. That's very kind. Thank you. As they left the restaurant, the evening air had cooled considerably. Daisy shivered slightly in her thin dress. Without comment, Zeke removed his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. "Oh, I couldn't," she began. "Please," he interrupted gently. "The cold doesn't bother me much." They walked in companionable silence toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, the stars emerging in the vast Kansas sky above them. Hays City was quieting for the night, though the saloons were just coming to life, their piano music and boisterous laughter spilling into the streets. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Daisy said when they reached the boarding house. "It's been—" She paused, searching for words, a bright spot in a difficult time. "The pleasure was mine," Zeke replied sincerely, retrieving the basket of baked goods from where he'd left it with the restaurant owner earlier. "I'll call on you tomorrow with news of any employment opportunities." Daisy accepted the basket with gratitude. As she returned his jacket, their hands brushed briefly, sending an unexpected warmth through Zeke's chest. Their eyes met in the lamplight, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. "Good night, Zeke," she said softly. "Good night, Daisy." He tipped his hat and watched as she entered the boarding house, wondering what circumstances had brought this educated Eastern woman to such desperate straits in Hays City, and why he felt so drawn to help her. As he turned toward his own lodgings, Zeke knew one thing for certain. Daisy Miller was not what she seemed, and he intended to discover the truth behind those guarded green eyes. Dawn broke over Hays City with the promise of a scorching summer day. Daisy awoke early, having slept better than she had in weeks, with a full stomach and the security of a proper roof over her head. The basket of baked goods Zeke had given her sat on the small table, a tangible reminder that yesterday's encounter hadn't been a dream born of hunger and exhaustion. She dressed carefully in her blue dress, her only respectable garment, and arranged her hair as neatly as possible. Today was crucial. If Zeke's employment leads proved fruitful, she might finally stop running and establish herself in this frontier town. If not, she pushed away the thought. She had perhaps 2 more days before she would be completely destitute. A knock at her door startled her from these worrying thoughts. Mrs. Henderson, the stern-faced proprietress, stood outside. "There's a gentleman caller for you downstairs, Miss Miller," she said, disapproval evident in her tone. "I run a respectable establishment, and I don't approve of—" "It's Mr. Nash," Daisy interrupted, maintaining her dignity despite the woman's implications. "He's kindly assisting me with employment inquiries." Mrs. Henderson's expression remained skeptical, but she nodded curtly. "He's waiting in the parlor. I expect propriety to be maintained." "Of course," Daisy assured her, gathering her shawl and heading downstairs. Zeke stood when she entered, hat in hand, looking every bit as handsome in daylight as he had the previous evening. He wore clean work clothes, practical but presentable. "Good morning," he greeted her with a warm smile. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in quite some time," she admitted. "Thank you again for your kindness." "I've already spoken with Doc Wilson this morning," Zeke said, getting straight to business. "He's interested in meeting you and Mrs. Edwards at the Bar X Ranch has agreed to interview you for the governess position this afternoon if you're willing." Relief washed over Daisy. "That's wonderful news. I'm ready whenever they are. Doc first, then, Zeke said, offering his arm as they stepped outside into the already warm morning. His office is just down the street. As they walked, Daisy was acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk. A newcomer on Zeke Nash's arm was apparently worthy of notice in Hayes City. She straightened her spine, refusing to be cowed by their scrutiny. "People are staring," she murmured. "Small-town curiosity," Zeke replied easily. "They'll find something new to gossip about by supper time." "Are you well known here?" Zeke chuckled. "Been around long enough to be recognized?" "The Bar X is one of the biggest operations in the area, and I handle most of the business in town for the ranch." They reached a modest building with Dr. J. Wilson, physician and surgeon, painted on the door. Inside, they found a cluttered office with an elderly man sorting through a chaotic pile of papers. "Doc," Zeke called, "this is Miss Daisy Miller I mentioned." The doctor looked up, spectacles sliding down his nose. "Ah, the teacher from Philadelphia. Come in, come in." For the next half hour, Daisy answered the doctor's questions about her education and experience, demonstrated her penmanship, and discussed the filing system she might implement for his records. By the end, Dr. Wilson was beaming. "When can you start, my dear? Tomorrow would not be too soon." "I would be delighted to begin immediately," Daisy replied, hardly believing her good fortune. They settled on a modest but fair wage, with work hours that would accommodate the possibility of a second position at the ranch if that opportunity materialized. As they left the doctor's office, Daisy could barely contain her elation. "I don't know how to thank you," she told Zeke as they walked toward the livery where he'd arranged transportation to the ranch. "Seeing you smile is thanks enough," he replied, then looked embarrassed at his own candor. "I mean, I'm glad to help a newcomer get established. Frontier towns can be hard on folks without connections." His genuine kindness touched Daisy deeply. During her difficult journey west, she'd encountered few people willing to help without expecting something in return. "The ranch is about 5 miles outside town," Zeke explained as they reached the livery. "I've arranged for a buggy, but I should warn you Mrs. Edwards can be particular. Don't be discouraged if she seems intimidating at first." "I've faced difficult interviews before," Daisy assured him, though privately she worried about making a good impression in her worn dress. The journey to the Bar X ranch took them through rolling prairie that stretched to the horizon in all directions. Wildflowers dotted the grasslands, painting swaths of color across the landscape. Despite her anxieties, Daisy found herself entranced by the beauty of the Kansas plains. "It's magnificent," she breathed. "So vast and open." Zeke glanced at her, pleased by her appreciation. "It grows on you." "I wasn't sure about Kansas when I first arrived. Seemed too flat after Texas hill country. But there's something about this sky that makes a man feel free." "Or a woman," Daisy added softly. He smiled at that. "Indeed." They crested a small rise, and the ranch headquarters came into view, a substantial main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings, all well maintained. Several cowboys were working in the corral, breaking horses from the look of it. "This is much larger than I expected," Daisy remarked, suddenly intimidated. "The Edwards family has built something special here," Zeke agreed. "They're good people, fair employers. Mr. Edwards started with just 100 head after the war, now runs thousands." As they approached, a woman emerged onto the main house's porch, tall, stately, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a severe bun. Her dress, while practical, was of fine quality, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Mrs. Edwards," Zeke greeted her, helping Daisy down from the buggy. "May I present Miss Daisy Miller?" "So this is your Philadelphia teacher," Mrs. Edwards said, her sharp eyes assessing Daisy thoroughly. "Come inside, Miss Miller. Mr. Nash, I believe you have duties to attend to." It was a clear dismissal, and Zeke tipped his hat respectfully. "Yes, madam. I'll return in an hour to escort Miss Miller back to town." Daisy followed Mrs. Edwards into a home that would have been considered well appointed even in eastern cities. The furnishings were substantial, the decor tasteful if somewhat austere. Through a doorway, Daisy glimpsed 3 children, 2 boys and a girl being supervised by a harried-looking young woman. "Miss Jenkins is leaving us to be married at month's end," Mrs. Edwards explained, following Daisy's gaze. "The children have had 3 governesses in the past year. None seem equipped to handle frontier life and proper education simultaneously." The interview that followed was rigorous. Mrs. Edwards questioned Daisy about her educational background, teaching methods, views on discipline, and knowledge of subjects ranging from mathematics to French literature. Finally, she asked the question Daisy had been dreading. "And what brings an educated Eastern woman to Hayes City, Miss Miller?" "It's hardly the usual destination for someone of your background." Daisy had prepared for this. "My parents passed away last year," she said, which was true. "Philadelphia held too many painful memories, and I wished to make my own way in the world." Also true, though incomplete. Mrs. Edwards studied her face, clearly sensing there was more to the story. "The frontier is unforgiving of secrets, Miss Miller. They have a way of revealing themselves at the most inconvenient times." Daisy met her gaze steadily. "I have nothing to hide that would affect my ability to educate your children, Mrs. Edwards." After a long moment, the older woman nodded. "Very well. I would like you to meet the children and conduct a brief lesson. Your handling of them will determine whether we proceed." The next half hour proved to be the real test. 10-year-old Thomas, 8-year-old William, and 6-year-old Elizabeth were intelligent but willful, clearly accustomed to testing new authority figures. Daisy drew on all her experience to engage them in an impromptu geography lesson, incorporating storytelling techniques that soon had even the skeptical Thomas asking questions about distant lands. When Zeke returned, he found Daisy seated in the parlor with Mrs. Edwards, finalizing arrangements. The children were begging their mother to keep this one. "It seems you've made an impression," he commented as they rode back toward town, the setting sun painting the prairie gold and crimson. "Mrs. Edwards has offered me the position," Daisy confirmed, unable to contain her smile. 3 days a week, with accommodations at the ranch during those periods. Combined with Dr. Wilson's work, I'll have a sustainable income." "That's wonderful news," Zeke said sincerely. "You'll be leaving Mrs. Henderson's then?" "As soon as I find more permanent lodgings in town," she nodded. "I'll need somewhere for the days I'm working with Dr. Wilson." They discussed practical arrangements as they returned to Hayes City, the easy conversation belying their short acquaintance. When they reached the boarding house, Zeke hesitated before speaking. "Would you allow me to call on you tomorrow evening? Perhaps we could celebrate your successful employment search with dinner." Daisy knew she should be cautious. Getting too close to anyone risked questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Yet Zeke Nash had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, expecting nothing in return. And there was something about him, a steadiness, an integrity that drew her despite her better judgment. "I would like that very much," she found herself saying. His smile warmed her more than it should have. "Until tomorrow, then." As she watched him walk away, Daisy acknowledged the dangerous truth she'd been avoiding. She was beginning to care for this cowboy who had rescued her from more than just a theft accusation. He had given her hope when she'd nearly lost it completely. But hope was a luxury she wasn't sure she could afford, not with the shadows of Philadelphia still lurking behind her. The next morning, Daisy began her new position with Dr. Wilson, arriving at his office promptly at 8 o'clock. The elderly doctor greeted her enthusiastically, eager to show her the chaotic record system she would be organizing. 30 years of medical practice in these boxes, he explained, gesturing to the haphazard stacks of papers and ledgers. I've never had the time or inclination to arrange them properly. We'll start with the current patients, Daisy suggested, surveying the challenge before her. Then work backward in an organized fashion. By midday, she had made remarkable progress, establishing a filing system that impressed even the skeptical nurse who assisted the doctor. The work was satisfying, a perfect use of her organizational skills, and a welcome distraction from thoughts of Zeke and their dinner engagement. "You're a godsend, Miss Miller," Dr. Wilson declared as she prepared to leave at 5 o'clock. "Already I can find Mrs. Patterson's records without turning the office upside down." "I'm glad to be of service," Daisy replied sincerely. "I'll continue tomorrow with the billing records." She hurried back to her boarding house, aware that she had limited time to prepare for her evening with Zeke. Mrs. Henderson intercepted her in the hallway, a letter in hand. "This came for you today," the woman said, eyeing Daisy suspiciously. "Rather quick for someone who's only been in town 3 days. Daisy's heart froze as she recognized the handwriting on the envelope. "Thank you," she managed, taking the letter with fingers that suddenly felt numb. Once in her room, she stared at the correspondence, fear tightening her chest. How had he found her so quickly? She had been careful, changing direction several times, using different names along her journey west. Yet somehow he had traced her to Hayes City. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and read the brief message. "I know where you are. You cannot escape your obligations. I will arrive within the fortnight to collect what is rightfully mine. You have disgraced your family's name for the last time. R.W." Daisy sank onto the bed, the letter falling from her grasp. Richard Whitman, her cousin by marriage and executor of her father's estate, had found her. The man whose unwelcome advances she had fled, whose threats had driven her from Philadelphia, whose influence with the authorities had made it impossible for her to seek legal protection. She had 2 weeks, perhaps less. 2 weeks of safety before everything she was building here would be destroyed. A knock at her door startled her from her panicked thoughts. Hastily hiding the letter under her pillow, she composed herself before opening the door to find Zeke standing there, hat in hand, dressed in his best clothes. "I'm a bit early," he apologized. "The meeting at the ranch finished sooner than expected." Daisy forced a smile. "I just need a moment to freshen up." As she turned to the small mirror to adjust her hair, she caught Zeke's reflection watching her with concern. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. "You seem troubled." "Just tired from my first day," she lied, hating the deception but seeing no alternative. "Dr. Wilson has quite the backlog of paperwork." Zeke nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, I hope a good meal and some pleasant company might restore your spirits." They walked to a different restaurant, this time smaller than the Dodge House but homier. The owner greeted Zeke by name, showing them to a corner table where a small vase of wildflowers added a touch of color. "A special table for special occasions." The man winked, leaving them with menus. "You arranged the flowers?" Daisy asked, touched by the thoughtful gesture. Zeke's cheeks reddened slightly. "Asked Mrs. Larson if she might find something to brighten the table. Thought it might remind you of home." The kindness of this action nearly broke Daisy's composure. How could she accept his friendship, his growing affection, knowing she might have to flee again within days? Throughout dinner, She struggled to maintain conversation, her mind repeatedly returning to the threatening letter. Zeke, perceptive as ever, noticed her distraction but didn't press for explanations, instead sharing stories of cattle drives and frontier adventures that required little response from her. "I've been talking your ear off," he finally said as they finished dessert. "And you've barely touched your food." "I'm sorry," Daisy sighed. "I'm poor company tonight." Zeke regarded her steadily. "Something's troubling you, Daisy. I won't ask what it is, that's your business. But I want you to know that if you need help, you only have to ask." His sincere offer nearly undid her. How long had it been since someone had simply offered assistance without conditions? Since before her father's death, certainly. "Thank you," she whispered, fighting tears. "You've already helped me more than you know." "Sometimes a burden shared is easier to bear," he suggested gently. For a wild moment, Daisy considered telling him everything about her father's death, her cousin Richard's control of the inheritance, his unwanted advances that turned to threats when she refused him, her desperate flight west. But fear held her back. Involving Zeke would only put him in danger. Richard Whitman was a powerful man with connections and resources. He wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who stood in his way. "Perhaps someday I can explain," she said instead, "but not tonight." Zeke accepted this with a nod. "Whenever you're ready. No rush." As they walked back to the boarding house under a sky ablaze with stars, Daisy found her spirits lifting despite her worries. There was something about Zeke's steady presence that made even the gravest problems seem more manageable. "Will you be at the ranch tomorrow?" he asked as they reached Mrs. Henderson's door. "Yes, it's my first day with the Edwards children," she confirmed. "Mrs. Edwards arranged for one of the hands to collect me at 7. "I'll make sure it's someone reliable," Zeke promised. "And perhaps, if you're not too tired afterward, we might take a short ride on Sunday. The wildflowers are spectacular this time of year." Despite every logical reason to refuse, to begin distancing herself from him, Daisy found herself agreeing. "I'd like that very much." His smile was worth the moment of weakness. Until Sunday, then. As she prepared for bed that night, Daisy knew she faced an impossible choice. She could flee again, abandoning the opportunity for stability she'd found in Hayes City. Or she could stay and face Richard, risking not only her own safety but potentially drawing Zeke into a dangerous situation. There was a third option, one she hardly dared consider. She could confide in Zeke, accept his help, and fight back against her cousin's threats. But that would require a level of trust she wasn't sure she was capable of anymore. With the threatening letter hidden beneath her mattress, Daisy fell into restless sleep, her dreams haunted by the past she'd tried so desperately to escape. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect Kansas summer day that belied Daisy's inner turmoil. She dressed carefully for her first day at the ranch, packing a small valise with necessities for her 3-day stay. As promised, one of the Bar X hands arrived promptly at 7, a weathered cowboy who introduced himself as Hank. "Mr. Nash said to take good care of you, madam," he explained, helping her into the wagon. "Said you're important to the ranch's future." Daisy felt a blush rise to her cheeks at the implication of Zeke's words, but she maintained her composure. "Mr. Nash is very kind to ensure my safe transport." The journey to the ranch passed quickly, with Hank sharing local history and pointing out landmarks along the way. By the time they arrived, Daisy had temporarily set aside her worries, focusing instead on the challenge of her new position. Mrs. Edwards greeted her on the porch, as formal as before but with a hint of warmth in her eyes. "The children have been asking for you since dawn, Miss Miller. I hope you're prepared for their enthusiasm." "I look forward to it," Daisy replied sincerely. The schoolroom, she discovered, was a well-appointed space with large windows overlooking the prairie. Maps adorned the walls, alongside bookshelves filled with volumes that would have impressed many Eastern academies. The Edwards were clearly committed to their children's education, despite their remote location. Thomas, William, and Elizabeth greeted her with varying degrees of excitement. Thomas, the eldest, maintained a pretense of dignified interest that barely masked his eagerness. William peppered her with questions before she could even set down her materials. Elizabeth simply slipped her small hand into Daisy's and declared, "I'm glad you're staying with us, Miss Miller." The day passed in a flurry of lessons, interrupted occasionally by Mrs. Edwards checking on their progress. By afternoon, Daisy had established a rapport with each child, identifying their strengths and the areas where they needed encouragement. Thomas excelled at mathematics, but struggled with literature. William showed remarkable aptitude for history, but resisted grammar exercises. Elizabeth absorbed languages with ease, but found numbers challenging. When lessons concluded at 4 o'clock, Mrs. Edwards invited Daisy to join the family for dinner. "Mr. Edwards is eager to meet the teacher who has accomplished what 3 others could not, keeping our children engaged for an entire day." Dinner was a lively affair, with Mr. Edwards, a robust, bearded man with kind eyes, asking thoughtful questions about Daisy's teaching methods and educational philosophy. The conversation flowed easily, interrupted frequently by the children's enthusiastic contributions. "We understand you're also working for Doc Wilson," Mr. Edwards remarked as they enjoyed apple pie for dessert. "Yes, 2 days a week," Daisy confirmed. "He's been very accommodating about scheduling." "Smart arrangement," he nodded approvingly. "Diversifying your employment shows good sense." After dinner, as the children were ushered upstairs for bed, Mrs. Edwards showed Daisy to her quarters, a comfortable room adjacent to the nursery, simply but tastefully furnished. "We've had a telephone line installed to the doctor's office in town," Mrs. Edwards explained, surprising Daisy with this modern convenience. "In case of emergencies, you're welcome to use it if needed." Alone in her room, Daisy's thoughts returned to the letter hidden in her valise. A telephone meant communication with town, a way to maintain contact if necessary. But it also meant Richard might more easily track her movements once he arrived. She was preparing for bed when a soft knock sounded at her door. Opening it, she found Mrs. Edwards standing there, a thoughtful expression on her face. "May I speak with you a moment, Miss Miller?" "Of course." Daisy stepped aside, inviting the older woman in. Mrs. Edwards remained standing, studying Daisy with shrewd eyes. "I've lived on the frontier for 20 years, Miss Miller. I've learned to recognize when someone is running from something or someone." Daisy felt the blood drain from her face. "Mrs. Edwards, I'm not asking for your confidence," the woman interrupted gently. "Your past is your own, but I want you to know that the Bar X protects its own. If you're in some kind of trouble, you needn't face it alone." The unexpected kindness nearly broke Daisy's careful composure. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you know." Mrs. Edwards nodded, apparently satisfied. "Zeke Nash speaks highly of you. That carries significant weight with my husband and me." She moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Miss Miller. Mr. Nash will be joining us for Sunday dinner tomorrow. I thought you might like to know." With that cryptic statement, she departed, leaving Daisy to wonder exactly how much the perceptive Mrs. Edwards had discerned about her feelings for Zeke. Sunday morning brought clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for the ride Zeke had proposed. Daisy spent the morning with the children, conducting an informal nature lesson on the ranch's grounds, identifying prairie plants and discussing their uses. Her students were enthusiastic outdoor learners, especially when their education involved collecting specimens rather than sitting at desks. By the time they returned to the house for dinner, Daisy spotted Zeke's horse tied at the hitching post, and her heart quickened despite her best efforts to remain detached. He was conversing with Mr. Edwards on the porch, both men laughing at some shared joke. When he caught sight of her approaching with the children, his smile broadened in a way that sent warmth cascading through her. He tipped his hat in greeting, his eyes never leaving hers. "Miss Miller has taught us about prairie medicine today," Elizabeth announced proudly. "I can identify 3 plants that cure stomachaches. Is that so?" Zeke replied seriously. "That's knowledge worth having on a cattle drive." "Are you taking us on a cattle drive, Mr. Nash?" William asked excitedly. "Not today," Zeke chuckled. "But I did promise Miss Miller a ride to see the wildflowers if she's still willing." All eyes turned to Daisy, who felt a blush rising in her cheeks. "I would enjoy that very much." Mrs. Edwards appeared in the doorway. "Dinner is served. You young people can go gallivanting afterward." The meal was delicious roast beef with all the trimmings, followed by Mrs. Edwards' famous peach cobbler. Conversation flowed easily, with topics ranging from cattle prices to the upcoming Founders' Day celebration in Hayes City. Daisy found herself laughing more than she had in months, temporarily setting aside her worries about Richard's impending arrival. After dinner, when the children had been excused to their afternoon studies, Zeke approached Daisy. "If you're not too tired from your teaching duties, that ride offer still stands." "I'd love to," she replied, ignoring the knowing look Mrs. Edwards gave her. 20 minutes later, they were riding side by side across the rolling prairie, Daisy on a gentle mare Mrs. Edwards had insisted was perfect for her. The vastness of the landscape took Daisy's breath away, miles of grassland stretching to the horizon, dotted with wildflowers in vibrant purples, yellows, and whites. "It's like an ocean of grass," she marveled. "That's what the Indians called it," Zeke nodded. "The grass sea. In spring, when the new growth comes in and the wind blows across it, you can almost see waves." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, cresting a small rise that revealed a creek winding through a shallow valley. Cottonwood trees lined its banks, providing welcome shade in the summer heat. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," Zeke said, dismounting and helping Daisy down from her horse. "I come here to think when decisions need making." They secured the horses where they could graze, then walked to the creek bank. Zeke spread a small blanket he'd brought in his saddlebag, gesturing for Daisy to sit. "You seem more yourself today," he observed as they watched the water ripple over stones. "Less troubled than Friday evening." Daisy sighed, plucking a stem of grass and twirling it between her fingers. "I received some unsettling news that day, a reminder of things I'd hoped to leave behind in Philadelphia." Zeke was quiet for a moment, skipping a stone across the water's surface. "Daisy, I know we haven't known each other long, but I want you to know you can trust me. Whatever you're running from, and I can tell you're running from something, you don't have to face it alone anymore." His perception startled her. "Is it that obvious?" "To someone who's paying attention," he replied gently. "The way you look over your shoulder in town, how you tense up when strangers enter a room, the careful way you answer questions about your past." He met her eyes directly. "I recognize the signs because I've seen them in others. Sometimes in myself." For the first time, Daisy considered that Zeke might have his own reasons for understanding her caution. "You said you came west after the war for a change of scenery. Was there more to it than that?" A shadow crossed his face. "Some memories are best left behind." "But yes, there were things in Texas I needed distance from." He hesitated, then continued. "I rode with a rough crowd for a while after the war, did things I'm not proud of, When I finally came to my senses, there were people who weren't happy about my change of heart. What happened? Daisy asked softly. I testified against some former associates, he said simply. Then headed north before their friends could express their displeasure. Kansas seemed far enough. This revelation changed something between them, the knowledge that they both understood what it meant to flee one's past. It created a connection, a foundation of shared experience. Taking a deep breath, Daisy made her decision. My father died last year, she began hesitantly. He was a respected professor at the university, but not particularly skilled with financial matters. My mother passed when I was young, so it was just the two of us. Zeke listened attentively as she continued. Upon his death, I discovered he had borrowed significantly from my cousin by marriage, Richard Whitman, a wealthy businessman. According to the terms of the loan, Richard became executor of the estate. She faltered, then steeled herself. He made it clear that he expected me to marry him to settle the debt, despite being 20 years my senior and recently widowed. I take it you refused, Zeke said quietly. Yes, which is when he revealed his true nature. Daisy's voice hardened at the memory. He threatened to have me committed to an asylum for feminine hysteria if I didn't comply. He had the connections to do it. Too, he owns half the city council. When his threats became physical, I knew I had to leave. So you fled west, Zeke concluded, where his influence couldn't reach. I thought so, Daisy whispered, finally coming to the heart of her fear. But he's found me. He sent a letter saying he'll arrive in Hayes City within 2 weeks to collect what is rightfully his. Zeke's expression darkened, a glimpse of the dangerous man he'd once been flashing across his features. No one's collecting you, Daisy, not while I'm breathing. His fierce protectiveness both warmed and worried her. I don't want to bring trouble to your door, Zeke. Richard is dangerous. He has money and connections, even out here. So do I, Zeke countered. Maybe not the money part, but connections. The Bar X isn't just any ranch. Mr. Edwards was a judge before he came west. He still has friends in high places. He took her hand, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew those hands possessed. You don't have to run again, Daisy. Not unless you want to. The hope his words kindled was almost painful in its intensity. What are you suggesting? That we prepare for Mr. Whitman's arrival, Zeke said simply. That we gather evidence of his threats, secure statements from people who can vouch for your character, and ensure the law is on our side when he comes. Our side, Daisy repeated, her heart stuttering at the implication. Zeke's gaze was steady, certain. Yes, our side, because I care about what happens to you, Daisy Miller, more than I probably should after knowing you less than a week. The confession hung between them, honest and unadorned. Daisy knew she should discourage him, protect him from involvement in her troubles. But selfishly, desperately, she wanted to accept what he offered, not just protection, but partnership. Someone to stand beside her rather than another long, lonely flight into uncertainty. I care about you too, she admitted softly, which is why I'm afraid for you to confront Richard. He ruins people who oppose him, Zeke. Let him try, Zeke replied with quiet confidence. I've faced worse odds. They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of their shared confidences settling between them. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, Zeke lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it, he promised. But know that you have allies, hear me, the Edwards family, even Doc Wilson. You've made an impression in a very short time, Daisy Miller. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the return journey. Riding back across the prairie, Daisy felt lighter than she had in months, despite the looming threat of Richard's arrival. For the first time since her father's death, She wasn't facing her problems alone. That night, after the children were asleep, Daisy sat with the Edwards family in their comfortable parlor. With Zeke's encouragement, she shared her situation, forcing herself to maintain composure as she revealed the circumstances of her flight from Philadelphia. When she finished, silence filled the room. Then Mr. Edwards leaned forward, his expression grave but kind. "Miss Miller, my wife and I came west partly because I made powerful enemies as a judge, men who didn't appreciate my rulings against their interests." He exchanged a glance with his wife. "We understand something about starting over, about building a life away from those who would control or harm you." "What Daniel is trying to say," Mrs. Edwards interjected with unusual gentleness, "is that you have a home here if you want it, and we protect our own." "Thank you," Daisy whispered, overwhelmed by their acceptance. "Now," Mr. Edwards continued, practical as always, "let's discuss strategy. Whitman will arrive expecting to find you alone and vulnerable. Instead, he'll find you established, respected, and surrounded by allies." A smile that contained more than a hint of his judicial past crossed his face. "I believe Mr. Whitman is about to discover that his Eastern influence means very little in Hays City, Kansas." As the discussion continued late into the night, plans taking shape, Daisy caught Zeke watching her with an expression that made her heart race. Whatever happened with Richard, she realized, she had already found something in Kansas worth fighting for, something she hadn't dared hope for when she fled Philadelphia. She had found a place where she belonged, and people who would stand beside her. Most unexpectedly, she had found Zeke Nash, a man whose quiet strength and unwavering support were rapidly becoming essential to her happiness. The next 10 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Daisy divided her time between teaching the Edwards children and organizing Dr. Wilson's records, establishing herself firmly in the community of Hays City. Word of her situation spread discreetly among trusted townspeople, orchestrated carefully by Mr. Edwards and Zeke to ensure she had allies without creating undue gossip. Sheriff Lawson, a fair-minded man with a healthy skepticism of Eastern gentlemen, reviewed the threatening letter and promised to keep a watchful eye for Richard Whitman's arrival. Doc Wilson, incensed that anyone would threaten his capable new assistant, offered sworn testimony regarding Daisy's character and competence, should it be needed. Even Mrs. Henderson, initially suspicious of Daisy, became protective once she understood the circumstances, promising to alert them immediately if any strangers inquired about her lodger. Through it all, Zeke remained Daisy's steadfast supporter, calling on her each evening she spent in town, accompanying her on errands and visiting the ranch frequently when she was teaching. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, evolving from cautious friendship to something more profound, though both carefully maintained propriety in public. On the evening of the 10th day after receiving Richard's letter, Zeke invited Daisy to dinner at the Dodge House. The restaurant's owner, now familiar with them as regular customers, had reserved their usual corner table, complete with fresh wildflowers. "You seem pensive tonight," Daisy observed as they enjoyed their meal. Zeke smiled, though there was tension around his eyes. "Just thinking. Whitman could arrive any day now, according to his letter." "I know," she sighed. "I find myself watching every stagecoach and train that comes into town, wondering if he's on it." "We're as prepared as we can be," Zeke assured her, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand briefly. "Mr. Edwards has spoken with Judge Carruthers, who's presiding in the county court this month. The sheriff is aware. Your position is secure with both the ranch and Doc Wilson. None of which would be possible without your help," Daisy reminded him. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for everything you've done." Something shifted in Zeke's expression, a momentary vulnerability she rarely glimpsed beneath his confident exterior. "You don't owe me anything, Daisy. I didn't help you expecting repayment." "I know," she said softly. "That's what makes it all the more meaningful." Their gazes held, the connection between them almost tangible in the quiet corner of the restaurant. Zeke seemed on the verge of saying something more when the door to the Dodge house swung open, admitting a blast of evening air and a man whose appearance immediately commanded attention. He was expensively dressed in a tailored Eastern suit, with a gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. His bearing suggested wealth and authority, his expression one of entitled arrogance as he surveyed the modest establishment with obvious disdain. Behind him, two younger men in similar but less expensive attire stood like sentinels. Daisy felt the blood drain from her face. "Richard," she whispered, her fingers tightening convulsively around her napkin. Zeke's posture changed, subtly still relaxed to outward appearances. But Daisy recognized the alertness that now animated his frame, like a predator scenting danger. "The larger fellow behind him looks like hired muscle," Zeke murmured, his gaze never leaving the newcomers as they secured a table. "The younger one might be a lawyer or assistant." "What do we do?" Daisy asked, fighting to control her rising panic. "Nothing right now," Zeke replied calmly. "He hasn't spotted you yet. Let's finish our meal normally, then I'll escort you back to Mrs. Henderson's. I'll alert the sheriff on the way." But fate intervened before they could implement this plan. As a waiter guided Richard and his companions to a table, the businessman's gaze swept the room and locked onto Daisy. Recognition, followed by triumphant satisfaction, spread across his features. "Daisy," he called, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "What a fortunate coincidence. I've only just arrived in town to find you." Every head turned toward their table. Zeke's jaw tightened, but he remained seated. Following Daisy's lead, Richard approached, ignoring Zeke completely as he addressed Daisy. "You've led me on quite a chase, my dear. Most inconsiderate, given your father's outstanding obligations to me." Daisy straightened her spine, drawing on a well of courage she'd discovered in herself during the past difficult year. "There's nothing inconsiderate about removing myself from unwanted attention, Richard. I've established a new life here, a respectable one." Richard's smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "A temporary situation, I assure you. We have family matters to discuss privately. I've taken rooms at the hotel across the street. You'll accompany me there now." "She will not," Zeke said quietly, rising to his feet. Though he spoke softly, there was steel beneath his words. For the first time, Richard acknowledged Zeke's presence, taking in his practical frontier clothing with visible contempt. "And you are Zeke Nash," he replied evenly. "Trail boss for the Bar X Ranch and a friend of Miss Miller's." "Ah, I see. You found yourself a cowboy protector, Daisy." Richard's tone dripped with condescension. "How quaint. But this doesn't concern you, Nash. This is a family matter." "Miss Miller isn't going anywhere she doesn't wish to go," Zeke stated firmly. "And from what I understand, you're no family of hers, just a creditor trying to collect a debt through dishonorable means." The restaurant had gone silent, every patron watching the confrontation with avid interest. Richard's face darkened with anger, but he maintained his composure, aware of their audience. "You're meddling in affairs you don't understand, Cowboy," he said coldly. "Daisy is returning to Philadelphia with me, where she belongs. Her father's debts ensure I have legal claim to her guardianship." "I'm 24 years old," Daisy interjected firmly. "I require no guardian, legal or otherwise, and my father's debts died with him, as you well know. Your claim is nothing more than manipulation and threats." Richard leaned closer, dropping his voice. "Careful, Daisy. You wouldn't want these good people to learn about your father's indiscretions, the gambling, the borrowing from his own department's funds. How quickly your respectable new life would crumble if they knew." Zeke stepped between them, his patience visibly thinning. "That's enough. Miss Miller has made her position clear. I suggest you return to your table and enjoy your meal." "Or what, Cowboy?" Richard sneered, his composure slipping to reveal the ugliness beneath. "Will you draw on me like some common gunslinger? I assure you, such actions would have consequences beyond your simple understanding." The tension between the men was palpable, the threat of violence hanging in the air. Daisy rose quickly, placing a restraining hand on Zeke's arm. "This isn't the place," she murmured. "Too many innocent bystanders." Zeke nodded slightly, acknowledging her wisdom while maintaining his protective stance. "Mr. Whitman," came a new voice from the restaurant entrance. Sheriff Lawson stood there, hand resting casually near his sidearm. "I've been expecting you." Word travels fast in Hayes City. Richard's expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time. "Sheriff, I'm simply having a conversation with my ward." "Funny, that's not how Judge Carruthers sees it," the sheriff replied evenly. "He's reviewed Miss Miller's situation and found no legal basis for any guardianship claim. In fact, he's quite interested in discussing with you these threats she's received." He tapped the pocket where Daisy knew he carried Richard's letter. The businessman's face flushed with anger. "This is preposterous. I have connections in Philadelphia, maybe," Sheriff Lawson interrupted. "This is Kansas, Mr. Whitman. Your eastern connections carry about as much weight as a feather in a windstorm out here." He gestured toward the door. "Now, I suggest you and your associates return to your hotel and reconsider your purpose in Hayes City. Miss Miller has established herself as a valued member of our community, with the full support of Judge Carruthers and the Edwards family of Bar X Ranch. Perhaps you've heard of former Judge Edwards. His opinion still carries considerable weight with the territorial authorities." Richard looked from the sheriff to Daisy, then to Zeke, assessing the situation with the calculating mind that had made him successful in business. Whatever he saw caused him to recalibrate his approach. "Very well," he said finally, his tone conciliatory though his eyes remained cold. "A misunderstanding, perhaps. Daisy, we should speak privately tomorrow when cooler heads prevail. I'll call on you at your lodgings. Any conversation you wish to have with Miss Miller can take place at my office, with her legal representative present," Sheriff Lawson stated firmly. "Judge Carruthers has appointed Mr. Edwards to act in that capacity." Outmaneuvered, Richard had no choice but to retreat, though the venomous glance he cast at Zeke promised this wasn't over. He and his companions departed, leaving the restaurant buzzing with excited whispers. "That was well timed, Sheriff," Zeke said quietly once they were gone. "Mrs. Henderson sent word that Eastern gentlemen were asking after Miss Miller," Sheriff Lawson explained. "Figured I'd keep an eye on things." He tipped his hat to Daisy. "Madam, I'd suggest you stay at the ranch tonight. Whitman strikes me as the type to try something underhanded." "I'll escort her there myself," Zeke promised. An hour later, they were riding toward the Bar X under a canopy of stars, having stopped briefly at Mrs. Henderson's to collect Daisy's essentials. The night was peaceful, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a soothing counterpoint to the evening's tension. "You were magnificent," Zeke said after they'd ridden in silence for some time. Standing up to him like that in front of everyone. Daisy smiled faintly. "I surprised myself. A year ago, I would have been too terrified to speak." "What changed?" She considered this thoughtfully. "Everything. Losing my father, having to make my own way, learning that I'm stronger than I believed." She glanced at him, her expression softening. Finding people worth being brave for. The significance of her words wasn't lost on Zeke. As they rode side by side across the moonlit prairie, something shifted between them, a deepening of the connection that had been growing since that first day in the bakery. When they reached the ranch, Mrs. Edwards was waiting, having received the sheriff's telegram about the situation. She quickly arranged a room for Daisy and assured her that Mr. Edwards would be present at tomorrow's meeting with Richard. "Try to rest," she advised Daisy. "Tomorrow will be challenging, but remember you don't face it alone." Left in the guest room, Daisy found she was too agitated for sleep. She moved to the window, gazing out at the vast Kansas night, wondering if she would ever truly be free of Richard's shadow. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Opening the door, she found Zeke standing there, his expression grave but determined. "I couldn't leave without making sure you were all right," he explained. "I'm better than I expected to be," she admitted, stepping aside to allow him to enter the room, leaving the door pointedly open to maintain propriety. Seeing him was shocking, but not as terrifying as I'd imagined. Perhaps because I knew I had support. Zeke nodded, remaining near the doorway. "Whitman won't give up easily. Men like him can't accept being denied what they want." "I know," Daisy sighed. "Even if tomorrow's meeting goes in our favor, he'll likely try another approach." "Which is why I have a proposition for you," Zeke said, his voice suddenly uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. He cleared his throat, visibly gathering his courage. "It might seem sudden or motivated by the wrong reasons, but I assure you, I've been thinking about this since well before Whitman arrived." Daisy's heart began to race as she realized what might be coming. "Zeke, hear me out," he requested gently. "I care for you, Daisy. More than I thought possible in such a short time. I hope you might feel something similar for me." "I do," she whispered, unable to deny the truth. His smile at her confirmation was breathtaking in its joy. "Then I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife. Not just to solve the Whitman situation, though marriage would certainly strengthen your position legally, but because I want to build a life with you, here in Kansas." The sincerity in his eyes left no doubt that this was no mere tactical suggestion. This was Zeke Nash laying his heart before her, vulnerable and hopeful. "I don't have much to offer materially," he continued when she remained silent. "I've been saving to buy my own small spread someday, but it's not much yet. What I can promise is that I'll work hard every day to make you happy, to protect and honor you, to build something meaningful together." Tears welled in Daisy's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that this good, honorable man wanted to share his life with her. After months of running, of fear and loneliness, the prospect of belonging with someone to someone was almost too much to comprehend. "Zeke," she began, her voice trembling with emotion, "are you certain? We've known each other such a short time, and I bring complications you never asked for." "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied without hesitation. "Life on the frontier teaches you to recognize what matters, Daisy. What's worth fighting for? You matter to me. Us what we could be together, that's worth any complication." She moved toward him then, propriety momentarily forgotten as she placed her hand against his cheek. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Zeke Nash." The joy that transformed his face was everything she could have hoped for. He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm with such reverence that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Tomorrow," he promised, "after we deal with Whitman, we'll speak with Reverend Taylor. If you're willing, we could be married by week's end." "I'm willing," Daisy confirmed, her heart lighter than it had been in years despite the challenges that still awaited them. More than willing. With reluctance, Zeke stepped back, respecting the boundaries their unmarried status required. I should go. There's much to prepare for tomorrow. Thank you, Daisy said softly. Not just for this, but for everything since that day in the bakery. You changed my life, Zeke. And you changed mine, he replied with a gentle smile. Get some rest, Daisy. Tomorrow we face Whitman together and then our future begins. As Zeke departed, closing the door softly behind him, Daisy returned to the window. The Kansas night stretched endlessly before her, stars scattered across the velvet darkness like promises waiting to be fulfilled. For the first time since her father's death, she looked to the future not with dread, but with hope. Whatever Richard Whitman attempted tomorrow, she would face it with Zeke beside her, and that made all the difference in the world. The meeting with Richard Whitman took place the following morning in Sheriff Lawson's office, a modest but well-kept space that somehow seemed smaller with the tension filling it. Daisy sat between Zeke and Mr. Edwards, drawing strength from their steady presence as Richard and his lawyer presented their case. The facts are simple, Richard's lawyer, a thin man named Hollister, stated. Professor Miller borrowed substantial sums from my client. Upon his death, the debt transferred to his estate, of which Miss Miller is the sole beneficiary. Mr. Whitman, as executor, has legal authority to determine how that debt is settled. And Mr. Whitman has generously offered to forgive the debt entirely in exchange for Miss Miller's hand in marriage, he continued, as though this were a perfectly reasonable arrangement. Mr. Edwards, every inch the judge despite his rancher's attire, leaned forward. I've reviewed the loan documents you provided, Mr. Hollister. They establish Mr. Whitman as a creditor, nothing more. Pennsylvania law, like Kansas law, does not permit creditors to force marriage as payment, nor does it grant executorship rights over adult heirs. Furthermore, he continued, producing documents from his own portfolio, I have here sworn affidavits from Professor Miller's colleagues at the university stating that Mr. Whitman pressured the professor into naming him executor through questionable means. I also have Miss Miller's detailed account of the threats Mr. Whitman made against her person, corroborated by this letter. He indicated the threatening note Richard had sent to Hayes City. Richard's face darkened with barely controlled rage. This is absurd. I've come all this way to resolve a family matter honorably, only to be treated like a criminal. Daisy knows her father's reputation would be destroyed if the full extent of his financial improprieties were revealed. I've kept his secrets out of respect for his memory. You've kept his secrets as leverage against his daughter, Sheriff Lawson corrected, speaking for the first time. That's not respect, Mr. Whitman. That's blackmail. Richard turned to Daisy, changing tactics. Daisy, be reasonable. You know Philadelphia society. How will you maintain your position without resources? What future can you possibly have in this wilderness? His gaze flicked dismissively to Zeke. With a cowhand. Your father wanted better for you. My father wanted me to be happy and secure, Daisy replied steadily. I've found both here in Kansas. As for my future, she glanced at Zeke, drawing courage from his supportive smile. Mr. Nash has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted. Richard's expression contorted with fury. This is outrageous. You cannot possibly. Miss Miller is of legal age to make her own decisions, Mr. Edwards interrupted firmly. Now, here is what's going to happen, Mr. Whitman. You will relinquish your position as executor of Professor Miller's estate immediately. Judge Carruthers has prepared the necessary papers. You will return to Philadelphia and cease all contact with Miss Miller. Should you attempt to harm her reputation or interfere in her life again, the affidavits we've collected will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities in Pennsylvania. I believe there are several business associates of yours who would be most interested in learning about your methods of persuasion. It was a masterful outmaneuvering. Richard's face cycled through rage, calculation, and finally grim acceptance as he recognized his defeat. The frontier legal system, with its practical approach to justice and disregard for Eastern social hierarchies, had proven unexpectedly formidable. "This isn't over," he said coldly as he signed the papers relinquishing his executorship. "You may have won this round, but remember who has influence where it matters." "Your influence ends at the edge of civilization, Whitman," Sheriff Lawson remarked. "And out here, we decide what civilization means." After Richard and his lawyer departed, Daisy remained seated, overwhelmed by the sudden resolution of the nightmare that had haunted her for nearly a year. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. Mr. Edwards patted her hand. "Legally, yes. He has no claim on you or your father's estate now. Whether he'll cause other mischief is another matter, but I suspect he'll focus his energies elsewhere. Men like Whitman prefer easier targets." "Thank you," Daisy said fervently, including both Mr. Edwards and Sheriff Lawson in her gratitude. "I can never repay what you've done for me." "No repayment necessary," the sheriff assured her. "Protecting our citizens is the job. Besides, it was satisfying watching that Easterner learn that Kansas isn't the lawless territory he imagined." As they emerged from the sheriff's office into the bright Kansas sunshine, Zeke took Daisy's hand, unconcerned with the curious glances from passers-by. "Well, Miss Soon-to-be Nash," he said with a smile that warmed her to her toes, "shall we pay a visit to Reverend Taylor?" The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Mrs. Edwards insisted the wedding take place at the ranch, overruling Daisy's modest suggestions for a simple ceremony in town. "Your family now," the older woman declared, brooking no argument, "and family celebrations happen at home." Word spread quickly throughout Hays City and the surrounding ranches. The marriage of Zeke Nash, respected trail boss of the Bar X, to the new schoolteacher and doctor's assistant was deemed an event worthy of community celebration. Offers of assistance poured in Mrs. Larson from the restaurant promised her famous wedding cake. The general store owner presented Daisy with fine fabric for a dress, and the wives of neighboring ranchers arrived to help with sewing and decorations. Through it all, Daisy found herself embraced by the frontier community in a way she'd never experienced in Philadelphia's rigid social hierarchy. Here, worth was measured by character and contribution rather than family name or wealth. The genuine warmth with which she was welcomed into their circle filled an emptiness she hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to heal. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the kind of autumn day that showcased the Kansas prairie at its finest. Golden sunlight bathed the landscape, wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze, and the sky stretched endlessly blue above the Bar X ranch. In Mrs. Edwards' bedroom, where she'd been given privacy to prepare, Daisy gazed at her reflection in the mirror. The dress they'd created was simple but beautiful ivory cotton with lace trim that Mrs. Henderson had contributed from her prized collection. Her honey blonde hair was arranged with wildflowers, and her cheeks were flushed with nervous excitement. "You look beautiful," came Mrs. Edwards' voice from the doorway. The usually stern woman's eyes were suspiciously bright as she entered, carrying a small velvet box. "I have something for you, a tradition in my family." She opened the box to reveal a delicate pearl necklace. "My mother wore these at her wedding, as did I. I had hoped to see my daughter wear them someday, but Elizabeth is many years from that milestone." She lifted the pearls, moving behind Daisy to fasten them around her neck. "Consider them borrowed until you have a daughter of your own to pass them to." Tears welled in Daisy's eyes at the unexpected sentiment. "Mrs. Edwards, I don't know what to say. You've brought joy back to this schoolroom, given my children the education they deserve, and made a good man happier than I've ever seen him," Mrs. Edwards replied simply. "No thanks necessary." She squeezed Daisy's shoulders gently. "Now, I believe your groom is waiting, and he's been pacing like a caged mountain lion for the past hour." Outside, the ranch hands had transformed the area beneath the largest cottonwood tree into a wedding bower. Wooden chairs borrowed from throughout the ranch were arranged in neat rows, filled with guests from Hays City and neighboring ranches. Reverend Taylor stood waiting beneath an arch woven with wildflowers and ribbons. And there was Zeke, standing tall and proud in a new suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his face alight with anticipation as Mr. Edwards led Daisy toward him. Their eyes met across the distance, and everything else seemed to fade away: the guests, the decorations, even the vast Kansas sky above them. In that moment, there was only Zeke, the man who had saved her in more ways than he would ever know. The ceremony itself was a blur of emotion for Daisy. Reverend Taylor's words about partnership and devotion, the cool metal of the simple gold band Zeke placed on her finger, the tender way he repeated his vows. When he finally leaned down to seal their union with a kiss, the cheers of their assembled friends seemed distant compared to the thundering of her heart. "Mrs. Nash," he whispered against her lips, the wonder in his voice matching the joy in her soul. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food and dancing and more genuine good wishes than Daisy had ever received in her life. Dr. Wilson danced with her, declaring that Hays City had gained a treasure when she stole that loaf of bread. Sheriff Lawson offered a toast to the quickest and most effective deputy he'd never officially appointed, referring to Zeke's role in the Whitman situation. The Edwards children presented them with handmade gifts, drawings, and a whittled horse from Thomas that looked remarkably like Zeke's stallion. As twilight deepened into night, Zeke led his bride away from the celebration toward a small cabin at the edge of the ranch property. "Mr. Edwards offered us the use of the line shack for a few days of privacy," he explained as they approached the simple structure. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and comfortable." "It's perfect," Daisy assured him, touched by the consideration. The cabin had been transformed by caring hands: fresh linens on the bed, wildflowers in jars on the table, a basket of food for their breakfast, and a bottle of good whiskey with 2 glasses set out for a toast. A fire was already burning in the small stove, casting warm light across the rustic interior. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nash," Zeke said softly, lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold with careful reverence. As he set her gently on her feet inside, Daisy was struck by the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment, from desperate thief to beloved bride in less than 3 weeks. Life on the frontier moved at its own pace. She was learning, unbound by Eastern conventions and measured instead by the authenticity of connections formed. "Are you happy, Daisy?" Zeke asked, watching her expression as she took in their temporary home. She turned to him, her heart too full for anything but honesty. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she admitted, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "When I fled Philadelphia, I thought I was running away from something. I never dreamed I was running toward someone, toward you." His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "When I paid for that bread, I thought I was just helping a stranger in need. I never expected to find the woman I'd been waiting for my whole life." The kiss that followed sealed more than just their wedding vows. It promised a future built on mutual respect and genuine affection, a partnership of equals facing the challenges of frontier life together. Later, as moonlight filtered through the cabin's small window, Daisy lay in her husband's protective embrace, listening to his steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. The journey that had begun with a desperate attempt to steal bread had led her to unexpected treasure, not just a husband, but a community, a purpose, and the discovery of her own strength. "What are you thinking about?" Zeke murmured drowsily, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. "How strange life's path can be," she replied. "A month ago I was alone and desperate, stealing bread to survive. Now—" She pressed a kiss to his chest, marveling at the intimacy they now shared. "Now I have everything I never dared to wish for." His arms tightened around her. "We'll build a good life together, Daisy. I promise you that." "We already have," she whispered, certain that whatever challenges the frontier might present, they would face them together, the teacher and the cowboy who had found each other against all odds in Hays City, Kansas. Spring 1878, 6 months later, the small house on the edge of Hays City rang with laughter as Zeke chased his young niece around the parlor, the 5-year-old's giggles filling the modest but comfortable space. Daisy watched from the kitchen doorway, a smile playing on her lips as she observed her husband's playfulness with his sister's child. "Uncle Zeke is silly," Emma declared, hiding behind Daisy's skirts. "The silliest," Daisy agreed, smoothing the child's dark curls. "But that's why we love him, isn't it?" Zeke approached, pretending wounded dignity. "Is that the only reason? And here I thought it was my rugged good looks and charm." "Those too," Daisy conceded with a laugh, accepting his quick kiss. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of change and growth. With their combined savings and a small loan from Mr. Edwards, they had purchased this house on the outskirts of town, close enough for Daisy to continue her work with Dr. Wilson, yet with enough land for Zeke to keep his horses and start the small breeding operation he'd always dreamed of. Daisy continued teaching the Edwards children 3 days a week, the arrangement working perfectly as Zeke's duties as trail boss often took him to the ranch. In town, her organization of Dr. Wilson's practice had proven so successful that he'd increased her wages twice, insisting her efficiency had improved his business considerably. Most surprising of all had been the arrival of Zeke's sister Rebecca and her daughter Emma 3 months earlier. Widowed by a fever that swept through San Antonio, Rebecca had accepted Zeke's invitation to make a fresh start in Kansas. Having another family member nearby had been a blessing for both Daisy and Zeke, especially with the news they'd recently confirmed. A knock at the door interrupted their play. Rebecca appeared from the guest bedroom where she'd been resting, smoothing her apron. "That'll be Martha with the supplies for tomorrow's party," she predicted, moving to answer it. Indeed, Mrs. Martha Wilson, the doctor's wife, stood on the porch with a basket of baking supplies. "I've brought everything for the cake," she announced cheerfully. "Though why you won't let me simply bake it for you, Daisy, I'll never understand." "Because Zeke specifically requested my apple cake for his birthday," Daisy explained, taking the basket. "It's the one recipe I'm confident in." "It's the best cake in Kansas," Zeke declared loyally, earning him an affectionate smile from his wife. As Martha and Rebecca discussed final arrangements for tomorrow's gathering, a combined celebration of Zeke's birthday, and their housewarming, Daisy found herself reflecting on how thoroughly she'd been embraced by the community that had initially been so alien to her. Where once she'd been a desperate outsider stealing bread to survive, she was now Mrs. Nash, respected teacher and doctor's assistant, with a circle of friends she treasured. Later that evening, after Rebecca and Emma had retired to their room and the house had quieted, Daisy and Zeke sat on their small porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Kansas sky. "Happy?" Zeke asked, his arm around her shoulders, his hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her abdomen where their child grew the news they planned to share with their friends at tomorrow's gathering. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Although I was thinking that we should consider adding another bedroom before winter comes." Zeke's hand spread wider across her stomach, his expression one of wonder that hadn't diminished since she'd told him about the baby. "I'll start on it next week," he promised. "Our little one will have the finest nursery in Hays City." Daisy smiled, covering his hand with her own. "Our child will have something far more valuable than that," she said softly. "They'll have your kindness and integrity. The same qualities that made you stop and help a desperate woman caught stealing bread." "Best decision I ever made," Zeke murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though asking you to dinner that night runs a close second." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the gentle Kansas night enveloping them in its peaceful embrace. So much had changed in 6 short months, yet the connection that had sparked between them that first day remained unchanged, deepening, strengthening, but recognizable as the same flame that had warmed Daisy's heart when all seemed lost. "I received a letter from Philadelphia today," she said after a while. "From Professor Winters, my father's colleague." Zeke tensed slightly. "News about Whitman?" "Yes, actually." Daisy's tone held satisfaction rather than concern. "It seems Richard's business practices have finally caught up with him. Several investors withdrew their support after rumors of his persuasive methods became known. The bank has called in his loans." "Couldn't happen to a more deserving fellow," Zeke remarked, relaxing again. "Seems justice finds its way eventually." "It does," Daisy agreed, "though sometimes it needs a little help from a kind cowboy and a former judge turned rancher." Zeke chuckled. "And a brave young woman who refused to be intimidated, don't forget her part." Daisy smiled, leaning up to kiss him properly. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said when they parted. "That first day in the bakery, why did you really help me? You didn't know me. I was just a thief caught in the act." Zeke considered her question thoughtfully. "I saw something in your eyes," he finally said. "Not just hunger or fear, though those were there. I saw dignity, determination, someone fighting circumstances rather than surrendering to them." His voice softened with memory. "And truth be told, there was a moment when you looked at that bread like it was the most precious thing in the world, and something in my heart just recognized you somehow, like I'd been waiting to find you without knowing it." The simple honesty of his answer brought tears to Daisy's eyes. "I'm glad you found me," she whispered. "We found each other," he corrected gently, his hand moving in slow circles over their unborn child. "And now we're building something that will outlast us both, a family, a legacy, a story worth telling." As the stars continued their stately procession across the Kansas sky, Daisy Nash nestled closer to her husband, profoundly grateful for stolen bread, a cowboy's compassion, and the unexpected path that had led her home.